Hello, everybody, and welcome to another talk. Today, I'm going to be speaking again with Edith Hathaway. Now, Edith came on this channel. I was just trying to think, when did I speak to you last time? Must have been good six
It
months
was
ago.
October of
Yeah, I
24.
was going to say about a
Yeah.
good 6 months ago. So at that time, we just did a sort of an introductory about your work, what you were doing, and we did that nice podcast looking at all those presenters, that Joe Rogan and Tucker Carlson and the other chap, David. Is it Bet David?
Bet
I
David,
can never remember his
Patrick
name.
Bet David,
I can never
Patrick
remember.
Bet David. Yeah.
So we were just looking at that. But the reason that kind of we got onto that talk was initially you wanted to do a talk about your work with the Jupiter-Saturn cycles. But I said at the time it's probably better to just break in with something more. I wouldn't say mundane, but just something that more people can relate to easily. The other
Right. Natal astrology. Yeah.
the Jupiter Saturn sort of conjunctions requires a little bit more. You'd have to understand a little bit more about astronomy, perhaps, and how things are moving, and it's a sort of global impact as well. So what we did was we sort of deferred that talk to now. So now is the time to do it. So I've invited Edith back on. So we thought what we did is well, I mean, I'm going to let you talk your way through it because you're the expert on this. But basically, it's looking at the cycles of the two outer planets. That for Vedically, that's where the kind of planets stop for us. I know Western kind of has the trans-Saturnians, but kind of Saturn is our furthest planet from the sun. So these are two big players in the chart. They're slow moving. They're very large. Although I think it's interesting, isn't it? If you go out visually and look at them in the sky, I mean, Jupiter's fairly easy to see, given its size and distance. Saturn, it takes a bit of a trained eye to find. It's a little bit brighter than the average star, but it's just its sheer distance from the sun. But it is a fascinating planet. It's probably always been my favorite planet just because of its rings and the kind of mystique that surrounds it. So I'm very interested to hear how you've worked on this Jupiter Saturn cycle, the conjunction cycles, and how it perhaps relates not only to a birth chart, but obviously mundane, the world matters and stuff like that. So anyway, over to you, Edith. Talk us through
Well,
this.
I should, before we run off and away, I should just also remind people that in the Vedic system, the astrology of India, there are some different meanings, and also predominantly, and of course, in the ancient Indian system, was always using the sidereal zodiac. So when I start talking about the signs and the elements and the larger cycles of where Jupiter, Saturn are in the elements, it will be the sidereal zodiac. So to remember that, and I do use Lahiri Ayanamsha. And Jupiter is always the Dharma, the planet of Dharma, right work, right purpose, very connected with ethics. And Saturn is the planet of karma. So the Dharma and the karma planets, these are the two. And even in Western astrology, they're called the chronocators, so the two hands on the clock.
Mm.
And so it's and these two, of course, are the two furthest planets out in the observable, the planets in the observable zodiac, what can be seen. And so it's important in that way. And I would say that especially for mundane astrology, what mundane is from the Latin, which means worldly affairs. Okay, all the affairs of when you name it, your town, your city, your state, your nation, your region. And so we say that Jupiter is humanitarian and ethical concerns, its law and lawyers, religion, and its leaders, education, especially higher education, institutions of learning, teachers, journalism and journalists, publishing, the publishing industry, the urge for political and individual freedom, thus patriotism and aspirations for national identity. So this is very strong in Sagittarius, especially. So therefore, the nation state, the wealthy, royalty. So the fire signs are associated with the wealthy. So royalty and ruling monarchs. Now, Saturn in mundane astrology is more associated with business. Not that none of these things are connected toward the birth chart, because you're also, if you've got strong Jupiter, like say in your ascendant, this is going to, like with Martin Luther King Jr., he had it in his ascendant in Aries, and he was a preacher. And so Jupiter is the priest in the planetary cabinet in the Vedic system. So, but we'll basically be talking about mundane astrology, but it affects the individual planet. So Saturn is business and status and consolidation of control and, consolidation of material resources and powers is very, very strong in Capricorn. And by the way, we do not have the outer planets ruling over signs in Vedic astrology. So Jupiter is ruling over Pisces as well as Sagittarius. Saturn rules over Capricorn as well as Aquarius. And you'll see that when we come to the elements, that Jupiter has particular strength in fire and water, and it's exalted in Cancer. And Saturn is very strong in Earth, which it owns Capricorn, of course, owns Aquarius and water sign, and is exalted in Libra. So again, Saturn, business, status, consolidation of material resources and powers, material security, iron, lead, zinc, black metals, coal, fuel of all kinds, especially oil, black liquids, gasoline, chemicals, inferior grains. We're in the Earth period, so we have GMO grains. We have genetically modified grains. Leather goods, weapons of defense, democracy or looking like a democracy. It's weakened, but we'll see. We'll talk about that as well when it's weakened in Capricorn. Because you've got a lot of money and business involved in the Earth signs in Saturn and Capricorn. And so, if it looks like a democracy, well, we move into the topic of elections and how elections can be purchased and how, in fact, anybody can be purchased for anything, for their expertise. So when we look at and there's another thing too that's very specific, because it's tropical astrologers also look at Jupiter-Saturn cycles. But I think I'm the only one recently who's looking at the larger cycles among Vedic and tropical. It certainly is open to any astrologer to look at. I have the first chapter of my book, my 2012 book, which is called In Search of Destiny. That first chapter is essentially on the timelines and covering the Jupiter-Saturn cycles over a 1400 up to 2400, so about 1,000 year period. And so I've been kind of steeped in all of this for over 15 years. And in the process, you learn and study a lot of history and geopolitics. And the more that you can do that, the more the symbols enliven actual events and prominent figures and prominent trends. So you learn to identify major trends and then the shifting of major trends and how they shift from one period to another. And what I call, so when I talk about an Earth period, what am I talking about? We might hear, you might want to bring up that slide 2, which is the Jupiter-Saturn conjunction cycles, 1900 to 2100. And I will just mention one other specifically Vedic thing when I'm discussing all of this. And that is that in Vedic, which is unlike any Western tropical astrology, we have something called a Graha Yuddha, which is planetary war. And there are 5 planets only which can be involved in it: Mercury, Venus, Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn. And when they're within 1 degree of each other in the same sign, or they could be adjacent signs, there is a planetary war. And the classic texts seem to vary on what establishes the winner and the loser in the planetary war. So I attribute my work on this very much to Chakrapani Lal, who's my mentor, my colleague, my friend. He passed away in October of 2017, so it's been 7.5 years now. He taught me the method that he and his family, because his parampara, this is family, as you may know, the Indians, and often the family, the astrology runs in families. So father teaches son, teaches his son, so grandfather, great-grandfather to the next in generations, and probably now all the women as well, of course. And so he learned from his grandfather and father a system which I won't go into here, but there is a long article about this that I wrote in, I think, 2002 or 3, and you can find that in the article section. Just hit it on the, enter it in the search button in my article section at my website, edithhathaway.com, and you can read all about it. But essentially, the order that I learned from Chakrapani is the largest and or most important one wins over the next one, and then the brightest planet wins next, and third in that order is the fastest planet. Okay, so largest, most important, brightest, or fastest. And even though Jupiter has more mass than Saturn, Saturn is, as we know, the most important planet in terms of its transits, its import, its rules over truth, reality, karma, and with its large ring systems, it exceeds the size of Jupiter. So we say Saturn wins over Jupiter. Jupiter, of course, and Venus are both very bright, but Jupiter wins over Venus because of its size, even though both are the brightest planets. So that subject already gives, as a Vedic astrologer, it gives this subject a little different twist. Also, of course, we're using nakshatras. So if you look at this first graph here that I designed, and then I had my webmaster execute, and I've got several of these. These are going to go in the second volume of my In Search of Destiny. Wish I had them for my first volume, but alas, it took several years to, there's so much to study here, so much to study. So these were these graphs. I mean, you can put together these years and the nakshatras and where the planets were, but then to discriminate where historically what's going on and what's happening and why is it significant where it's going on.
I think he's done a really nice job. They look really good graphically. They're really nice to look at, and they're laid out very well. I mean, you can kind of see what's going on, even if you didn't really just coming to this by the graphic. You're starting to get a sense of what it's about. So I think you're doing a good job.
Good. I appreciate that feedback. And you see that what's in the kind of gold in the center, I have designated as the core of the Earth period, which you see is a 120-year period. Now I've said, I've got the round years rounded off, 1920, 1940s, 1960. Now we all know that it was February 1961. Well, we all astrologers know. February 1961 is when that first Jupiter-Saturn conjunction in Earth occurred, in sidereal Earth, in the core period. Now, there was the other one that's also extremely important because it was the first one to begin the actual Earth period, was in September of 1921. And I'm going to give you some important events that happened around that date, which describes. But remember, and I'll keep reminding you of these definitions again, that Saturn is going to be an amazing planet of business and the strength of bankers and industrialists. And what have we had? Look at what we've had in this whole period. of an incredible prosperity. Obviously, some sectors of the world left out. I'm not saying the entire world is living in prosperity. There are impoverished sections of the world, and unfortunately, a lot of that happens through corruption and money going to the places it's supposed to help. For instance, we notice huge amounts of money have been fed into Africa, but it still remains poor. And why is that? So I'll try not to get off on so many tangents we could get off on. But we notice that the theme that keeps recurring for Earth is that all the factors that I just read, and please do interject anytime, Andrew, when you have a point to raise or a question to ask about, because there's so much content here. We see that Jupiter ruling over religion, education, and publishing and ethics and so many things. He's going to, especially in the 1961 up to 2020, which is the first 60 years, it's going to struggle to keep its head up high, because why? And this is another strictly Vedic component, that in 1961, notice that I think I do give the degree there, yes, to Uttarashada, the nakshatra Uttarashada, which means the later victor. We have something called Vargotama. And so that means that in certain degree areas, the sign repeats in all the different divisional charts called Varga charts in the Sanskrit. And so when it repeats in the same sign, it can be very strong or it can be very problematic, depending on what's going on. So I've already mentioned about the Jupiter-Saturn conjunction being a Graha Yuddha. So notice how in that 1960, well, it's 61 actually, February of 60, just into 61, you have a Jupiter-Saturn conjunction, which is in the first 3 degrees, 20 minutes. It's called a pada of Capricorn. So in the chara or cardinal signs, Capricorn, Libra, Aries, Cancer, those cardinal signs, or we call them chara signs, those first 3 degrees, 20 minutes are going to be Vargotama. So what is that going to mean? That's going to mean that Jupiter is especially weakened in the first 60 years. Now, why the first 60 years? Especially because Jupiter is debilitated in Capricorn anyway, and it's losing the planetary war to Saturn. Now, so this is Vedic, and it's also my contribution here, because there's nobody else talking about it this way. Also, nobody else is talking about the junctures of the cycles, the larger cycles, the way I am. But essentially, we already know, just as an overview, the Jupiter-Saturn cycles are socio-political, economic indicators of cycles. They give us those indicators. So you say, well, what do they indicate? Well, it's you get some strong indicator every 20 years of a shift or change or emphasis. And further, this is my original work as well, further emphasis comes from whether that conjunction occurs is it empowered by several factors. The core of the Earth period, I do define here, that if it's the start or the end of the core period, there's a certain power that conjunction has. And you see there that there's in addition to that, the 61 conjunction is Vargotama, so it has extra power. Now, you also have a lot going on. And is my next point. Actually, the next point on the list is whether it occurs at the solstice, the equinox, or the galactic center. And yes, in 2020, December 21st of 2020, in the Northern Hemisphere, we have the Jupiter-Saturn conjunction at the winter solstice. So that was a very, very powerful conjunction. And then what I call triple conjunctions, not to be confused with a 3-planet conjunction. It is not 3 planets. It is Jupiter and Saturn coming into conjunction 3 times in a row within usually one calendar year. Like in 1980, it was December 30th of 1980, and that was again in the spring and the summer. December of 1980, and then March, and then July. And that one, for instance, everybody should recognize that, Virgo, and it was in Hasta, which rules over the hand, and Virgo is ruled over by Mercury, and Mercury, of course, the communicator, and Mercury is exalted in Virgo, rules over Gemini as well, but it's exalted in Virgo. And what do we have in this period? From 80-81 onward, this is what I call the age of communications, information age. That's what I've named it, because from then on, we had a flurry of inventions with the cell phone, the internet in the 1990s, the laptop computer. So we moved from a mainframe computer that only could be housed in a huge building that only a small number of people could handle, to the desktop or laptop computer that any person could have. So it, just like the cell phone, that then made everything accessible, and you could put it in your hands. Hasta. So you had a very, very powerful information age that came. And you might say, well, what is Aries? What is a conjunction in Aries doing in there? Well, it's 2852 Aries. So it's an anomaly. And you can have, actually, I'm going to show the previous water and fire periods. There were no anomalies. So it's rather rare.
I think we should say that the planetary motions aren't clockwork, so there are things that happen. But from our point of view, I was going to also make the point. I don't know whether it's something that would factor in, but I suppose given that those 2 planets are so far from the Earth, from our perspective, they're always pretty close to the ecliptic. So when they're conjunct or in planetary war, they're literally going to be on top of each other, whereas the other planets have got their orbits, they're closer to us, so they're more likely to sort of be above or below each other. Would I be right in saying that? When you see them astronomically, because they're at such a distance from us, their orbits will look like they're very close, even though
they would.
But from our perspective. So I wonder whether that would add an extra planetary war quality to them, that when they collide, they really collide.
That's an interesting point, and I'm sure an astronomer would have maybe more to add about that. I think for us, we were talking earlier about people are doing work with Venus-Mars cycles and other ones, but really you can't, and Andre Barbault has done work with Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto, and I've certainly done that in the past, in my ancient past, where I was a Western tropical astrologer. I started making that transition in the late 80s. Just as I was writing my book on Western tropical astrology, which is called Navigating by the Stars. I do have a chapter in there on Pluto, and I do look at them when they come into the birth chart in a very close to important, or even in mundane astrology, to a very important point. Within a couple of degrees, I will certainly look at them. But I think we're very gifted with these Jupiter-Saturn, the regularity of it. I mean, Pluto's got 208. I mean, we're just having the Pluto return in the U.S. chart, and the nation is in its 250th year. Next year, 1776, with the Declaration of Independence. So we're coming into our 250th year. So Pluto actually is past year. So it's about 248 years. So it's a little harder to do regular patterns with planets with that huge a cycle. So
it's got a very weird orbit as well, Pluto. It spends a lot of its time outside of the zodiac, so it's not even in the zodiac, a lot of its orbits.
exactly. And of course, not to mention it's been demoted to I still think I think of it as a planet, not a planetoid or whatever they named it now. But it certainly has a lot of power and a lot of punch. But I still come back to the Jupiter-Saturn as major indicators. So the reason I had you pull up this chart is to show, and we will be focusing on this a lot, is to show the points, what I call these standout conjunctions. And so they're standout for one of these reasons that I've listed here. Start or end of the core period, if they're Vargatama, and then again, Vargatama and the other Chara, it's the first 3 degrees 20 minutes of the cardinal signs. In the fixed sign, it's the 3 degree 20 minutes in the middle of the sign, and the dual, or Westerners know it as mutable signs, Virgo, Pisces, Gemini, Sagittarius. It is the last 3 degrees 20 minutes. Those are the Vargatama degrees. And so the sign becomes very potent, the planets in that sign. And so do you want it emphasized or not? That's the other thing you have to look at. Whoa, it's very strong. Is this a good thing or is this a problem? Right? Usually in a birth chart, it's a sign of it gives extra strength. So we like to see it in a birth chart. What is the other? Okay. And the other thing I'm going to be pointing out, and I could do that right away, is to notice how the juncture, and I had my webmaster make this deliberately in a V formation to give extra emphasis to the juncture at 2020, because it's quite a pivotal one this time. Why? In my estimation, because the major trends, and that's what this talk is about, is that we have the capacity with the Jupiter-Saturn conjunction cycles, the smaller and the larger ones, both, to identify major trends and major trend shifts. And there's observable trend shifts in my opinion, and they come up, you'll notice, even more than, I don't want to make it set, but certainly if we were to set it in the 5 years before and after 2020, I will identify for you some of the major events that identify a huge shift of trends from 2015 to 2025. And most of us have lived through that. I would say all of us. If you haven't, you're too young to understand.
Watching this. Yeah.
You're too young to understand this talk if you're watching it 2025. So just to make the point, and then I'm going to start defining what do I mean by the shifts and changes of trends. And of course, what I've said is this is an enormously, we've consolidated. It's been an amazingly powerful period in which companies and businesses and banks have grown like crazy. They've also caused problems. I'll get into that in a moment. But that trend started to come in very strongly in the early, if we go back to the 1900 to 2100 chart, they started to show themselves right there in the turning, of course, the World War I period, and the forming of the U.S. Federal Reserve Bank, which was the beginning of what I would say was a harbinger what the Earth period. All right, so I'll start defining some of this. So to compare it to the fire and water periods. So what this was the United States was incredibly prosperous between 1877 and right up to 1913, which interestingly was the year before the World War I began. And it was the year before the taxation took place. And it was the year in December 1913, when the Federal Reserve Bank was signed into law. And that's a very interesting story in itself. I have to be very careful I don't go down too many historical tangents here, but they're all fascinating. It's in itself was a sign of what I'm going to, if I had to round it all up in one word to describe the extent of I've been talking about consolidation of material resources and competition between bankers and businessmen. And essentially, you had a small group of bankers who didn't like to see their banking realm be competed with other successful smaller bankers. And so they set up the U.S. Federal Reserve in order to eliminate any they saw as undue competition. And so they consolidated banking power. And in that realm, there's a wonderful quote by, of all people, who lived in the century before, Thomas Jefferson. I just think it's a magnificent quote when you consider all things. He said pretty much know it by heart, but I'll just look at my note here. Again, a Thomas Jefferson quote. He lived from 1742 to 1826 during the fire period. And he said, banking establishments are more dangerous than standing armies. That was to be very prescient, because basically what you had was a nation, in the case of the U.S., whose citizens did not want to enter World War I, but the banking establishment was determined that the country would enter World War I. And in fact, that the war, for many reasons, because they'd loaned money to England and France, and they were losing the war, and that could not be allowed. And so the U.S. was forced to enter through various machinations, and the war lasted another several years. And then, of course, as we know, the Treaty of Versailles led to essentially the Second World War, because it was so much unfair. Everyone agrees at this point that it was stacked with so much unfairness and punitiveness to Germany. Germany should have won the war in 1916. But the bankers, and I'm sorry if this sounds oversimplified, but essentially, I think the more you study it, you'll see that that this is correct, and that Thomas Jefferson was correct, and that the bankers wanted to make sure that they didn't lose their investment, that they recouped it and made something on it. So the U.S. citizens did not want to enter that war, and yet we did. So here we are, and so the Treaty of Versailles was signed in 1919, and in 1921, September was the first conjunction in Virgo. And 6 weeks before that was the founding of the Council on Foreign Relations. And 4 weeks before that, July 1 of 1921. And we have those charts here, but again, I think that's going to be going a little too far afield. That's the founding of the Chinese Communist Party, which what does that have in common with these themes? It's control of material resources, and Jupiter, which is ethics and the rights of citizens and religion, all of those things are totally discounted in communism, right? So, and the Council on Foreign Relations was very active. It's still active today in pushing for the CIA, which was the outgrowth of the OSS, and for control over the way nations would run their geopolitics, and very important, how the media would be run to convey certain authorized messages. Very important.
Mm.
So that was the Council on Foreign Relations, CFR. And if you'll remember, Jupiter rules over publishing and the media. You could say Mercury, but Jupiter rules over the publishing industry, and Sagittarius rules over Sagittarius, which is the larger dissemination of information as education, educating the public, and as part of the checks and balances on government.
It's a bit like
so
was it orthodoxy of scripture, isn't it? Like Jupiter, that he controlling the Vedas, isn't it? Like making sure everything's going.
Absolutely, absolutely. There is a given truth, and let me learn that truth or those truths. Right. Whereas notice what we have now is anything. The truth is it whatever you want it to be.
How does it? Yeah, if it feels right, it's the truth.
If it feels right, or if I don't feel like the sex I'm born in today, I can change it. All of that, so that all of this. Now, obviously, there are people who feel very strongly about this, but it is part of this transgender ideology. Is part of. It goes hand in hand with. I'm making a few leaps here. But it goes hand in hand with the concept of Jupiter being weakened in Capricorn. One of the things it is enormously lucrative for surgeons and the pharmaceutical industries. So they have a lot of interest in that. And those who believe that, in terms of personal freedoms, you should be free to, mutilate your body or do whatever, just so so there's a whole subject there, right?
But is that whole trend around like 1960s anyway? That big shift in consciousness around the sort of 1960s, wasn't it?
Yes, the love generation. Do whatever you want. Yeah, love child, and
of course, all those people then are like the people that are kind of in the positions of power now. All those sort of 60s kids are now all the politicians, and they gravitated to the sort of directors boards of these large companies, and it's just
well, exactly. But what's interesting is that the communists, this again takes a lot of research, but you open your eyes. The communist infiltration into, and I of course can speak most authoritatively about the American situation. Of course, it always seems to my British friends and clients always tell me, "Hey, whatever you've got comes over here." So, but as I say, it could be true, but we've been infiltrated by the communists, education-wise, and definitely since the 90s. So you see a lot of that. Coming out of the universities, the word is, and yet now you have a turn back. So this is shifting, but this is what we've been dealing with, and I don't want to jump around too much, but we're definitely going to be discussing current trends. But you can see how, and you're right, the hippies, what was that famous rock concert in the 60s?
Oh yeah, Woodstock.
Thank you. Woodstock, and just let it all hang out, kind of thing.
I was just thinking,
So you
in terms of music, culturally, there was a lot of big shift in the music trends in 1960, but similarly, 1980s was a big change in the music scene as well. Like you had the end of that kind of the big band sort of rock bands of the sort of 70s, moving into the sort of electronic sort of dance, new agey kind of end of punk, all those kind of things. That was also like 1980s as well. So that's another sort of significant or period of interest there.
absolutely, you're going to see so many cultural, you can make so many connections. I say, I'm going to try to steer us in such a way as to, so we can cover this without going down too many rabbit holes, but it becomes absolutely fascinating
Hmm.
to look at that. And also with points along the way, um, let's see, did I make I made my points about the Vargatama, the Graha Yuddha, and also when you're looking at this 200 years here between 1900 and 2100, you're looking, just remember that the core of the Earth period, so core is what? That's when it's not shifting between one thing and another. So notice how powerful this 1900 to 1960, or if you want to be exact, the last fire conjunction in Sagittarius was in November 1901. The next one, and that began the core of the Earth period, was February 61. Now, why do I say that? Because my definition, and again, I came up with the definitions, which seem fitting enough, I believe, where you have to have, according to my definition, in order to have a core period, you've got to have at least two conjunctions in a row in the same element. Now, the Earth period is, you'll see, compared to some of the other ones, is the only one that has this shift in the middle of the core period. But I allowed it because it was, look at this, it's 28:52. It's just under 29 Aries. So it's 1 degree, 8 minutes. It's again significant. 108, 1 degree and 8 minutes away from being in Taurus. I say 108 because that's a significant number in
Vedic.
Vedic astrology. Don't want to have too many in jokes here or remarks. So that's why the core period is defined by two, at least two in a row, have to be. So this is the mutation, because you've got fire moving into Earth, but not completely. And you'll see in 1940, 41, all of these in the three conjunctions over about a year brought us into what I call the atomic age. So where I call 1980, 81 the information age, 1940, 41 brought us into the atomic age. So it changed our society totally. It brought us into this technology is very strong in Earth because you can harness the powers. You have the ability to do that and distribute it. I could give the stories of various industries, the car industry alone, until you had various different automobiles being invented in the 1880s.
Mm.
But until you had the invention of the hydraulic brake system in 1919, you could not manufacture cars in mass production.
Mm.
Okay, so then you had it. So you shifted gears, and as I love to point out, this was the last 20 years in our lifetimes, which was the age of the horse as a primary means of transportation.
I was thinking as
Oh, we
well.
still have it. I'm sorry.
I was thinking as well with the earth element. If you think about traditionally, you would mine metals, so there'd be ore mining, and it would be like you'd have a concentration of it. But so much of the new metals, these rare earth metals that we're using now, they're distributed very finely in large areas of Earth. So you've got to literally churn up hundreds of millions of tons of earth just to sort of sift through to find these rare earth metals that they're sort of looking for now, like the sort of cobalts and the lithiums. And so what I'm saying is it's like it really fits with that earth element, doesn't it? It's like before mining was much more cleaner, it was more concentrated, it didn't spread, but now they're looking for these things that are spread out more. You have to mine more of the earth's surface to get a similar amount. So that the mines are
Mhm.
literally huge, like great open cast mines where they literally burrow into the earth and turn up,
Right.
tons of
And
it.
the technology of how to use them. Okay, so now we have them. What can we use them in? And so, all right. So then so once again, looking at the Earth, core of the Earth cycle. So once again, have a look and remind yourselves that the juncture at 2020, in other words, halfway through the core period, we have what I call a standout conjunction, which again, these are my definitions, but I found it to be true. And we're living through it. So we'll see. We'll see if I'm right. I believe I am. We'll see. But my thesis, which is my original thesis, is that if there is a standout conjunction, which I've defined over here on the left, what constitutes a standout conjunction, then there is the possibility that the major trend of the period will be reversed. At the very least, it will be resisted. It will encounter enormous resistance, as we've seen. So at the core of the Earth period, I've been saying that at least from 2015 to 2025, and we're right in the thick of it, you've seen great resistance to what I've defined as the major trend, and of course, the subtrends. The major trends, as I've defined it, of the Earth period, and it showed up before 61, showed up, I think, essentially with the founding of the Federal Reserve Bank, which, by the way, the Trump administration has talked about eliminating. So we'll see. The founding fathers never would have approved of the Federal Reserve Bank. It is not federal. It is not a reserve bank, and it's a private. It's private. There's so many ways in which it's counter to the Constitution of the U.S. So, but that's another whole subject. There's a great book on the subject called, and I've got it here, The Creature from Jekyll Island by G. Edward Griffin. So, and I've already said how those bankers, the consolidation of the top, about, I think, 5 or 6 bankers, may have been a few more, who consolidated their wealth and insisted on World War I and on from there. Now, so let's look. I'm going to get into these, what define these resistance points. But before I do that, I want to compare we'll go to the fire period. Okay, so the core of the fire period, which runs from 1782 to 1901, and obviously I can talk at length about any one of these charts. What's really important, and of course, as I said in the very beginning, the nation state and the desire for individual freedom, particularly from the persecution of religion, of choice of religion, that was a major reason why people fled to the British colonies in North America. It was a major reason not to establish a slave trade, as is falsely taught. Really important to learn the real history. They fled to of course, there was original exploration back in the water period, which we'll go into next. But notice that there is if you look around the middle of the period, 1841, there is no standout conjunction. So what would this mean? This means that the trends of the period Again, I have made these definitions, but then they correlate with history. There's no major change of trend. And what was the trend? The trend was to build the nation state and make it strong. And the strongest of, and by the way, nation states that were formed during the core fire period tend to be some of the strongest nation states still, the United States being the one, number one. That it's 4%, I believe we're 4% of the global population, and yet we're the strongest economically and in many other ways. Education, we've fallen downhill. Guess why? Jupiter doesn't do well on an Earth period. So we've fallen, but it's beginning to be realized and turned around. And we have, so I'm going to talk about the hope for that. Notice, I just have to point out one thing here. In 1782, very powerful conjunction. Why? It's not only the beginning of the core of the fire period, but it's at the galactic center. Very, very powerful. Mm. And this is why I think I use the James Kelleher, often refer to it as the Kelleher USA chart. It's a 8:59 Sagittarius rising is 1776 Philadelphia, 6:30 p.m. and it gives 8:59 Sagittarius rising. It, to me, is the correct chart for the U.S. It has 4 planets in Gemini, including Venus and Jupiter and Sun and Mercury. And no. Mercury is infamously with Rahu in Cancer in the 8th house. We may talk about that because we're in Rahu-Mercury period right now. So our propaganda is at an all-time high. Interestingly, and I heard Vladimir Putin say this of all people, where we've been taught in the U.S. that nobody does propaganda like the Pravda and the Russians. And the difference, I've heard jokingly people say, well, the difference between U.S. and Russian propaganda is at least the Russians know that they're being lied to, but Americans don't. They call it Pravda on the Potomac. And when I say that, I should qualify that we're talking about the mainstream media, the establishment or so-called legacy media, which has been ruled over with an iron hand for years by, of course, the Council on Foreign Relations, which gives them their talking points. Okay, now you emphasize this. Now you emphasize that. This is where we're going now. And you notice they have all the same phrases and words if they want to emphasize them. Go ahead. You were going to say something.
Yeah, I was just going to say you hadn't marked in the other elements. You haven't gone. I don't think the water one's got it in it either, but you haven't got it in that chapter.
Yeah, I'm just using water. We haven't had air for a long time. I'm only comparing because I've got them historically. I can talk about them. So yeah, when we talk about water, we're also going to notice if there's any trend change. There's not.
And how about as they come in and go out, like a dasha period? You notice that before you're approaching the next element, there's a sort of small transition period where one bleeds.
Oh yeah, well look at look at the difference in just look between 1900 and 1961. And I've even conjectured that any countries, and there's so many of these African nations that were established, let's say have a founding date after 1961, they're very weak. They're very weak astrologically. I think that's because they have the imprint of the Jupiter-Saturn in Capricorn. They don't have what Sagittarius brings people together under the same ethos. We're together, we're maybe different, but we all want the same rights and freedoms. And the United States has a particular strength. And I never realized this till fairly recently. I think we're the only country on earth that has a constitution that says that we have not only our individual freedoms and rights, but that they are God-given. And there's an enormous amount of attention to God's role in this whole thing. So that's what we're going to be looking at as well, is the importance of the sacred and the religion in forming a nation state and keeping it together, right? And you have so much, like, look at all the trouble you have in South America now because of communist infiltration, and the last thing they want is a nation state, and the last thing the globalists want is a nation state that has people, has citizens with any rights. Now, but switch gears here for a moment and look in the core of the fire period. And we know we're going to have something very, very important happen around 1782, right? Now, notice our founding was in 1776 based on what? Piece of paper called the Declaration of Independence. Now, we'd been in some battles. We'd had the Battle of Lexington and Concord. We'd had several battles, but essentially all of the founders could have been picked up and hung in a public square, right? Because they were saying, we no longer obey the King of England. We are declaring independence. And he, it was George III, right? I don't know, it was George III. Yeah. George III did not want this to happen. So notice how 1775, all the way up to, I think, the last battles of the American Revolutionary War were in 1781, might have been that fall. And then you have this very important conjunction, and I wish I had I can get it in my book. So in 1782, the conjunction, November 5th of 1782, the Jupiter-Saturn conjunction was at 718 Sagittarius on the galactic center, and the winter solstice was at 911 Sagittarius. So it was very, very powerful. And then just a few months later, February of 1783, yes, it was King George III, announces, I love this name of this, he calls it the cessation of hostilities. Right? It doesn't say you won, it just said we're
not fighting anymore.
Yeah. You beat us. We never thought you'd do it. We have the strongest armies and navy in the entire world that's ever existed. But you beat us. Well, we're just calling it a cessation of hostilities. I love that. A typical British understatement, right? And then in September 3rd of 1783, the peace treaty is signed. So notice how long that took. I mean, that's 8 years. So you could say, well, that's 8 years before the core period, but you were already in a water to fire. I call it a mutation period, right? But basically, mutation periods are going from one dominant element to the next, so they're going to be back and forth. So it's not like nothing important can happen there. It's just showing a shift in trends. So yeah, 7, 8 years.
And would it be stronger between something like fire and water because they're so opposites, aren't they? Like a Gandanta point, isn't it? Like a crossing between two harsh elements that are mutually repellent, whereas like...
Well, actually, in my view, the way, even though that's true, Jupiter does well in both of them. And so I see a natural transition because water, and we'll go to water. So that's the point I wanted to make. Let's just quickly show the water period. And notice, before I do, notice that there's no special standout conjunction in 1841. You had expansions. Oh, by the way, you had 16 in the first, I think, 15 years between 1800 and 1801 and 1815, roughly. You had 16 nations established, founded in South America, uh, declaring their independence from Spanish, usually Spanish or Portuguese empires. So all of that was happening. That's a huge number of new nations. So, and then 1820 was the Monroe Doctrine in the United States. And notice Sagittarius is the most nation-oriented, the most patriotic sign, and in a way, the most religious. So all of these things combined. Notice Sagittarius is at the beginning, middle, and end, just like Capricorn is at the beginning, middle, and end of the Earth cycle.
Mm.
So Sagittarius is keeping these nation states expanding and doing well, in my opinion, and that history bears it out. So I don't find, so notice water, so we go to water, which is the core period of the water. Most of them tend to be about, well, the fire, notice how fire and earth are about 120 years core. Water, I notice everything lasts longer. The gestation period takes longer. So this one's 158 years. And there's no standout conjunction in 1623 at the juncture. And water, again, to remind us, actually, I don't think I went over these. Did not go over this. I was going over Jupiter-Saturn. Water, religion, and royalty predominate. And the most important explorations are done through sea voyages, usually for the glory of the monarchy or religion. So, and often both, like Isabella and Ferdinand and Isabella.
Why is the period longer? Why is it 158 then? What would have
just as you were saying before, is not
just
a
because it's not clockwork? Yeah, something.
Yeah, in fact, if you want to look into that, notice that's why I like the South Indian chart. The 4 signs, we know that each sign of the zodiac is not precisely 30 degrees, right?
Mm.
We know actually that the dual signs, what we call dual, Westerners call them mutable, Sagittarius, Pisces, Gemini, Virgo, those are the largest constellations.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
So we know that. My personal observation of history, and also just think about gestation. Okay, you could say, well, it takes 9 months to birth a human baby. But just looking through and noticing things that happen, like the printing press actually was in the, oh no, it was 14. Oh, I don't have the date right in front of me. I won't take time to search it. The printing press, it took years before the first books became more easily available. And if you were to predict using this system what that book was likely to be, well, it was the Bible. And that's why you had, by the way, the highest literacy rates in the US and probably elsewhere as well. At the time of the founding of the nation, there was 99% literacy rate because everyone wanted to read their Bible. Now we have the latest statistic I just read, 54, this is in the US, 54% of the population reads at a 6th grade or below level. It's shocking. So and some people say 50%. And then you have the schools and colleges turned into indoctrination centers. You're not going to have people learn. So notice how Jupiter fits into this. Jupiter rules over education and knowledge. And education is doing very well. And you might say, wow, they didn't have the internet. They didn't have encyclopedias.
Like apprenticeships, didn't you? You would join something, you would learn a trade, you would do it right from the beginning. You'd spend years perfecting it. It's something like
Absolutely.
that. Yeah, that's really fascinating
Absolutely.
about that thing with water. It's quite interesting, isn't it? I remember something similar when I was looking at the orbit of orbit of the moon around the Earth and different latitudes, and how if you go north, the moon spends slightly more time in Critica, but if you go over India, it spends more time in the nakshatra of Rohini. So that's the moon's favorite mansion, right? It like Rohini the best. So from that
Right.
latitude, its orbit, from their perspective, the moon spent something like 4 minutes longer or something in that sign. So it's kind of, it could be just something like that, the way that the orbits are configured and the way our orbits configured and how they move, and just somehow when they're adjacent to certain signs, they appear, or the transits can just take longer or something, you know. And
Well,
there's
and you
so many
notice, and
planets.
I'll just briefly show, I'll show and notice how this one, since it's longer, notice how it isn't all three one signs. It starts with Scorpio conjunction, Jupiter, Saturn, and Scorpio. The middle is Jupiter, Saturn, and Cancer.
Mm,
So, of course, royalty, keeping the monarchy going in certain families, and then certain royal families ruled across Europe, and then it ends Pisces. So you go from Scorpio, Cancer, Pisces, all three water signs.
mm.
Now, notice how, now this is the largest. If you go to the uh, next slide, which is,
Yeah.
I can't
So,
seem to
oh
get
no,
it up
what
here.
the larger cycle is sidereal 1400 to 2400.
Yeah, the very largest one. Yeah, this is the period I cover in my book and give annotated and unannotated timelines. And so here you see any mutation period that involves water, which I've had my webmaster do in red with the red arrows.
Mm,
Notice how they're longer than any of the others. And doesn't that make sense? And fire, anything particularly fire, fire to earth, let's say, moving into fire is slightly longer, it's 80 years. And you're moving out of fire. What does fire do? It dissipates at the end, right?
mm.
There's
Turns to
only
ash.
60
That's
years.
it, gone. Yeah.
Only, so we could try to work out the logic of it astronomically, but there is a certain logic to the elements.
Mm,
And anytime, you just notice, anytime water is involved, either in its dominant period or in its mutation period. So here, there at the beginning from 1405 to 1544, that was when the printing press was invented. And then it took years, as I said, for anything to happen. But it was all religious. All the major discussions of the day had to do with religion. And if we conquer a new land or we explore a new place, we've got to spread our religion.
mm.
And also, the downside of that is it could be quite dogmatic. We've got to destroy the religion of the people there. They are pagans. We've got to remove that and put ours in its place. So there's all of that. You can have
Or
dogmatism.
kind of morph with it, isn't it? A lot of cultures that did that, they found it was much better to make the one that you're trying to replace as part of yours. So you don't get rid of the gods worshipped by the natives. You make the gods subservient to your god, but brought into the canon, so to speak.
Exactly. Well, I find a parallel with, and I found myself discussing this in one interview I did somewhere in the last year, where I found myself saying, because we have a Judeo-Christian culture that is Western civilization, and yet here I am steeped in, Vedic astrology is based in Hinduism and multi-gods and so forth. To me, as a Vedic astrology practitioner, and this may, of course, sound like heresy to a Christian, but I find no contradiction because basically they both see life as a sacred thing. The human being is sacred. All these deities are showing there's so many aspects of the divine. You have to have more beings to define them.
Mm.
Right? So you're not casting shadows on Judeo-Christian. You're just saying there's more to this sacred that we can describe, and that anyway. So that's another whole topic. But so to see a larger picture here. So next, I think the most logical, because we're looking at the larger picture from 1400 to 2400 and noticing that the water periods and their mutation periods, no matter into the sign or out of the element, that are rather were longer. But now we want to focus back on the juncture. We've noticed that fire and water periods did not have any standout conjunction at the juncture point, but the Earth core period is unique amongst all these core periods over a couple thousand years, right? Plus, we're living here, we can observe it, and we have been observing it. So I will just go over some things. So we may be in error because we're so in the thick of it. We don't see some things. For instance, with the language being turned around, because I think our language and our media is being manipulated quite a bit. Along those lines, there was something I wanted to bring up that I had unearthed, by the way, and this is in the way of covering the juncture point. But I wrote an article back. I was just looking when I was preparing for this talk, and I had done an article in December of 2018 on the U.S.-China trade wars, which we were involved in then as well. And I was discussing a topic which is actually one of the first topics I was going to bring up, because it was first being brought out in 2015, and that is the UN Compact on Immigration. And that was signed actually the month that I wrote the article, December of 2018. But it started to become prominent in the news in 2015, at some point in 2015. And the name of it is very Orwellian, particularly now when we see the impact of it. The full title of it is the United Nations Compact for Safe, Orderly, and Regular Migration, which basically said that, and this was backed by the United Nations, which is a globalist organization, as is, you might say, well, what are globalist organizations? Well, the European Union is a globalist organization, and the World Economic Forum is a globalist organization. And their ethos, and we find this in many places. There's a quote that I have in that several articles, or at least my most recent one a year ago, by David Rockefeller in his 2003 memoirs. I don't have it right in front of me, but basically he's saying that the elite intelligentsia, made up of bankers and businessmen and so forth, are much better equipped to handle ruling over nation states than mere citizens. He makes no secrets of that. There's quite a bit of, you might think I'm being cynical in tone, but there's quite a condescending tone to the remark. And you find, so Rothschilds, Rothschild, of course, is a major supporter, backer of Emmanuel Macron, president of France, and who's a major globalist. But so this 2015, and another thing about the compact, that most nations signed except for the United States under Trump. Biden did sign it. Obama was very enthusiastic about it. all presidents before Trump um, were basically globalists. And in fact, another thing, and I may have mentioned this earlier, I'll reiterate it. The Earth Summit held in Brazil by the UN in June of 1992 preceded this 2020. So that's 28 years, 29 years to be exact, is a Saturn orbit.
Yeah, one
okay.
orbit.
So anytime you have a Saturn orbit or return to its previous sign, you have something significant happening, because you're going to observe, has the thing that began at the beginning of the Saturn's, well, beginning date, so we put it that way. So June of 1992, is it going to manifest or not? Go ahead.
I was just going to say, well, is it true to say? I mean, looking as an outsider, when I look at this, I tend to think of, yeah, Jupiter and all the significations we use in Jyotish for Jupiter, and then Capricorn. Obviously, it's fallen. I'm just sort of wondering, is there any element of like the caste system in that? Because you've got Jupiter's like the Brahmins, Capricorn's very much kind of an earth, so it's like that trader merchant. So it's a bit like Brahmin manifesting through commercial, like a commercially based Brahmin or something. It's like mixing those castes up, which is always given in the Vedas as being really
well. That's interesting you mentioned that, because what you've had all through 2020 and essentially for the last 12 years, a Jupiter cycle. And I most recently wrote about that in my Saturn in Pisces article, is a Pope who agreed to have a secret agreement with Chinese communist China, which has never happened. And previous popes refused to allow it to happen. I mean, the communists are basically militant atheists. So this is a very serious situation that it's endangered so many Catholics and Christians in China. Okay, so that's a very interesting parallel. I don't tend to use those social levels, but it could be. I mean, just the thing that Jupiter is religion, and it's there's more persecution of Christians happening in the last 10, 20 years. And, to look on the upbeat side, I would say, what was it, 2017, I think it was, that the Cathedral of Notre Dame nearly burned down.
Yeah.
And then just recently, President Trump, or President-elect Trump, I think it was in December of 2024, President Trump attended the opening ceremony of it. So all these years later, with American contributions as well. But one of the things I meant to, I'm going to bring up here, just in terms of language and of, as we know, the European Union, and you're in the thick of it, wanted to, its goal is to minimize the importance of the nation states, and the rulership should come from the unelected bureaucrats in Brussels. And a lot of nations, including Britain, didn't like that, because it obviously negates so many cultural and national things. And a couple of quotes I wanted to just bring up that from this article of mine from December 2018, which is relevant to the whole concept of, well, what's the big deal between the nation state and globalization? And globalization, in this case, you have to realize, is way more than international trade. It is a whole ethos. It is a whole orientation, such as it became much more overt at the Earth Summit in the UN Earth Summit in 1992. They formed, and you can look it up and read it. I'm not going to go into the whole thing here. Agenda 21 was supposed to be achieved by 2020. And what came in the way? Why didn't they achieve it? Donald Trump came along and got elected instead of Hillary Clinton, and that was a crisis for the globalists. Okay, and so here are a couple of quotes that I found or refound from that article. One was from Macron, president of France, still, although hanging on by a thread, it would seem. Patriotism, quote from Macron, patriotism is the exact opposite of nationalism because nationalism is treason. George Orwell reminds you.
But what would
something like that.
Looking at the core Earth period then? So what would be the wild card of American politics changing in 2016? Is there something that you could see that would show?
Well, yeah, because what that, and just one other quote I'll bring up, and that's Angela. It's okay. Angela Merkel and Barack Obama. These are some of the chief cheerleaders for the global compact on essentially unlimited mass migration of immigrants. Okay, so if you look back to 2015 and see how Europe has been inundated, how the US, especially under a Democrat, because Trump wasn't having it, but the Biden administration welcomed as many immigrants as possible, and at least we don't know the exact number because there's so many gotaways, but some people estimate 15 to 20 million got in, at least well over 10 million or 12 million. And so Angela Merkel, similarly to Macron, says, and this is in 2018, nation states must today be prepared to give up their sovereignty. So point is that nation states are really the only way that citizens have any real rights and freedoms. And you can see, if you look at Agenda 21 from the United Nations, which was supposed to come to fruition in 2020, but didn't. So now they have Agenda 2030 they're trying to propel. And the general theme of things is they create some kind of major emergency, like the climate emergency or a COVID emergency, so that everyone has to buckle down and stay home or close their business and all of that. So I'll just go over a couple of events. So the first one was when that agenda compact on migration came out, and it was, I would say, catastrophic for especially Europe and the US. Hopefully we're reversing it. And you had in June of 2016, 2015, Donald Trump declared his candidacy, but he was the first strong non-globalist leader. All the previous ones were globalists, and he had 16, 17 competitors. It was a big race. And he was, at first, people discounted him, but he won out over Hillary Clinton. And in the previous June was Brexit, which was major. I think the vote was 52 to 48%. But you had the resistance to it was the leaders really didn't intend to implement the policies that the people voted for. Okay, so that's, you look at resistance, and then you look at the resistance to Trump. They caused him trouble at every point. They tried to, the long list of things they did to him. Spied on him, impeached him twice, said he was colluding with the Russians. They ran with that. The media ran with it. It's totally false. It's totally invented. We now know, we knew really at the time, but the mainstream media was not saying. It was the Hillary Clinton campaign that funded that whole thing. So then, so those were major events that happened. Then in 2020, you had, just like you had in 2000, you had a very large transfer of funds because that year, and this is not even mentioning 2011 and the Patriot Act and all of that, and wars in Europe, not Europe, but the Middle East that the US instigated. But you had China entering the WTO. So you had the largest of transfer of wealth to China, starting really in the 1990s. You had 90,000 factories and 5 million employees lost their jobs to China. Okay, so you had a huge transfer. And that's, of course, Trump is reversing that, or trying to reverse it, in the midst of fighting the judiciary over it. So, but the COVID, we had a crisis that was mandated shutdowns and vaccinations. It was the most 2020 is known. I was amazed to read this, but it wasn't a surprise. You had all these businesses that were forced to shut down, and they kept, I don't know what it was in other countries, but in the US, the big box stores were allowed to stay open and all the smaller stores had to shut down. With the exception now, talk about the sacred and the profane. You were allowed to keep liquor stores open, strip joints could stay open.
All the important stuff.
Casinos. Yeah, churches had to close, or maybe they were allowed to hold a service outside. So notice the churches were, and many of them sued later, right? So basically, I mean, it's in line with the symbolism of the Notre Dame being burned. We still don't know exactly how that happened, but many Christian churches across Europe and even across the US and Canada that I know of have been either vandalized, burned, attacked, Christians attacked. So it's a big attack on Christians. And just to, Western civilization is considered, the principles of Western civilization are considered to be those of the Judeo-Christian civilization, basically. The rights and freedoms, the sacredness of life. And by the way, I just was reading that the new Pope, who will be installed formally in a few days, he has said, he's formally announced that how these are traditional Catholic beliefs, but the church has gone pretty soft on a lot of them and gone very how should we say, that gone very woke on them. Let's have euthanasia, let's have as many abortions as possible, let's have all kinds of irregularities. And he's come out today and made some very traditional statements. And of course, as everyone knows by now, this is the first, I shouldn't say of course, this is the first ever American Pope, American-born North American Pope in all the thousands of years of the papacy. So we have that. And with COVID, the largest massive transfer of wealth to the top 1%. So what have I been saying about Earth and Capricorn? And at this, you have an emergency declared, which in many ways was false, right? I could go over with you. I have this book here called A Patriot's History of Globalism, Its Rise and Decline by Larry Schweikert. And he lists eight ways in which the media, which was of course guided by the World Health Organization, made all kinds of false claims, saying that this was an extraordinarily deadly virus and that everyone had to be vaccinated. There was no other way to handle it. And they censored anyone who had any doctors who knew quite a bit about virology and so forth. So all of that was coming. It was a major crisis, all of civilization, because this was all across the world. And this major transfer of wealth to the top 1%. And as I said, this was preceded in 2000 by $50 billion transfer of wealth from the American US middle class, essentially to China. And then everything related to China in December 2001 allowed to join the WTO, World Trade Organization, which allowed them to become wealthy. The idea was, let's let them in and they'll surely follow our ways and become democratic. Well, they didn't. They didn't, and they see it as a way to conquer their enemies through ruthless means, including, as we've seen, the poison of fentanyl across our borders. And
so what would be the general trend? I mean, given that this is like the focal point, or the
right. So now
where do you see it going from here? Do you see it's going to?
Okay, so what we've seen is that in 2024, Trump was reelected because he had a first administration. I believe he was cheated out of the election in 2020. There's a lot of proof of that. And we may see that the courts did not allow any of the evidence to be shown. So interestingly, actually, some people are saying it's through divine providence that he's here in 2024, because he had time to gather his forces and gather a stronger team. Because you can imagine the people who've been in power for essentially over 100 years. If you consider Council on Foreign Relations, all of these things have been going strong since 1921 at least, right? And ruling over mainstream media. So they've been organizing the propaganda that the world is a certain way and Trump is this and Trump is bad and Orange Man bad and all of that. Media having mainstream media having a great control over that. But the shift in gears, one of the major shift in gears, is that you've got huge pushback on globalist leaders, right? All through Europe. Now, I could go through different countries. They've tried to get rid of them.
I would say it was everywhere. Even in, like, everybody just hates anybody in authority in any country. I don't think there's anyone that is liked now, is there, particularly? I mean, maybe some of the...
Well, where the people, globalists have had control for so long. So somebody comes in, I mean, you can just see what they did to Bolsonaro. They basically declare that even though he obviously won overwhelmingly, but they declare the election invalid. And then they don't allow anyone to dispute it. And if you dispute it, you're going to be put in jail. So, and then, of course, they try to kill them. Same thing that they've done to Trump. They've tried to kill him. So there's several leaders like this across the world. They that are actually gaining in power, like Marine Le Pen in France. So then they declare, oh, well, something's wrong with, I'm sorry, I can't give you all the details, but
there was a financial question whether she'd miss
something like that, dig up something, or if they can't dig it up, they make it up. Like the Russian collusion was totally fabricated. But if you've got control of the media, now the difference is that you've got huge amount of burgeoning alternative media that are pummeling the mainstream media. The mainstream media is falling down. Their viewership, their readership. So that shows you, I mean, the title of this, Larry Schweikart is a very esteemed, is a retired professor, New York Times bestselling author, American historian. A Patriot's History of Globalism, Its Rise and Decline. He doesn't say fall because they haven't fallen yet. But this is it's like taking a Big Mac truck, or more appropriately, one of those huge ocean-going ships that takes a massive amount of energy to stop and turn around. I mean, this is, you might think it's an extraneous bit of history, but it's absolutely relevant now, especially where the US is in the Rahu Mercury dasha. And this goes out to March of 2026. Then it'll be Rahu Ketu, approximately another year. This is across the second, eighth house axis. So there's a lot of, and it's Mercury Rahu. So it's our ability to do public relations very well. We spread our culture. It's in Cancer. Mercury isn't great in Cancer or water signs in general, but it shows how we spread the word. But so my point is that part of what we're needing to, and we are, I think, overcoming in this juncture here, is where we've developed this wide-ranging alternative media and podcast empires and you name it, the alternative stratosphere of, well, I don't know what else to call it, but independent media. In fact, that was the topic of, I first talked with you, that, with Joe Rogan and Tucker Carlson and Patrick Bet-David. And Tucker Carlson happens to be a good friend of Donald Trump's. He's a good friend of his son, Don Jr., and one of the key people influencing Trump in terms of the younger generation. And his show, his interviews are kind of pivotal, and they show a different point of view that's not going to be in mainstream media. In fact, he was fired from Fox. Of course, they never said they actually fired him and all of that. But we all know he was fired because he was a truth teller. He was covering subjects the officials did not want him to cover. So on a hopeful note, this is where I believe we're going, because otherwise, if we don't shift gears here, then what we've seen, like with the Pope, and we've just had it in the last week, the change in the papacy. Now, the Pope Francis was ill and was expected to die actually January, February. He was very, very ill in the hospital. But he was he's definitely a very liberal, leftist, globalist Pope, and in bed with the Chinese Communist Party. And he still has not released this secret agreement. He's been receiving $2 billion a year from the Chinese Communist Party, which is very, very bad and very dangerous for Chinese Catholics, for sure, and not good for the Christian church essentially throughout the world, definitely not the Catholic Church. Mm. So that is that's a positive sign. Some people are not that encouraged because he was he was considered very close to Pope Francis, and Pope Francis obviously sought him out. He was only made a cardinal in September of 2023. So he was elevated by Pope Francis. So obviously Pope Francis found commonality with him. But I think what we're going to find is little more traditionalism. In fact, part of the reason, if you dig deeper, the biggest contributions financially to the papacy, they've got a ton of real estate, but they're very poor and cash poor because the American Catholics have withdrawn their support. They've gone so far left. Mm. So they need the American support. And as we know, I think it's 54% of Catholics voted for Trump, are conservative Republicans. Mm. And actually, the Pope has two brothers in the U.S., and they've been giving very interesting interviews. And the brother, Louis, who lives in Florida, is a Trump supporter. And Pope Leo himself is a Republican. He's from Chicago, from the Chicago area.
Well, I was going to ask you also about the Jupiter symbology. Not that I particularly, when I'm looking at the planets in terms of planetary metals, I don't particularly, I mean, I use a couple of metals for Jupiter, but obviously because it's rulership over the second house, like with wealth, it's traditionally sort of tied to gold. And there's this whole thing
Yes.
about the gold. You know, this sort of gold fiasco at the moment, isn't it? Gold's as high as it's ever been at the moment. You've got this thing about Fort Knox going on. They're talking about auditing it. The Nixon thing, you know, they're coming off the gold standard. Do you see any correlations between Jupiter and that whole monetary system as well?
Well, I wish I knew, but we do know that the one thing, gold has stood the test of 5,000 years. It has held its value.
Hmm.
So it's kind of like the parallel to Jupiter as being the truth and the truth teller and the sacred and the traditional. And gold is a metal which has never lost its value. Now, the dollar, the US dollar, is in danger of losing its status as the world reserve currency. It's being challenged now. And if it loses that status, the uh, BRIC countries being Brazil, Russia, India, China,
Yeah.
South Africa, some other nations are joining them. They want to get out. And of course, it's been abused. The whole American dollar system has been abused, definitely during the Biden administration. So you can see why they're trying to get out of it. And also I think in the Biden administration, they had impounded Russian funds, and I think they were even taking them. I mean, it was just awful. It was like renegade stuff, not we want to be a nation that other nations can trust. And that's how you get world reserve currency, as we got at the end of World War II.
Hmm.
So yeah, gold is predicted by gold experts, shall we say. The latest I heard was that in I don't know how many years there right now it's been hovering back and forth between 3,200, 3,400, shoot up to 3,500 by the end of the year. Others are talking $6,000, $10,000 an ounce.
Hmm.
Um, and if that's so, well, and it's very pivotal that was Nixon in 1971 that decoupled the dollar from the gold standard.
That's what I was thinking about. I wonder whether there was any correlation there, whether that whole kind of, you know, coming off the gold standard. There's been so many calls to go back on it again, isn't it? Just sort of
Yeah, that exactly. No, that was seems to be a very unwise move. That was in 71. That would have been at a Jupiter-Saturn opposition was in, and that, by the way, in June of 71, just happens with the Jupiter-Saturn. It was opposite in Aries, Libra, and also in Taurus, Scorpio with Saturn in Taurus and Jupiter in Scorpio. And that chart, by the way, talking about the one individual, we haven't mentioned any individuals, but Elon Musk happens to have that June 28th, 1971. Jupiter-Saturn opposition is typically pretty close opposition, by the way, is a typical signature for an entrepreneur. So, and that opposition, now that create, of course, an opposition is always or can be a crisis point in a cycle where things shift and change.
hmm. Summarizing all of these points then and looking at the cycle as you're seeing it, what do you kind of predict ahead? Are we sort of coming, you said there's this pivotal point around 2020, unusual in this cycle because of the solstice alignment. So moving out of this cycle, are you seeing the current trend continuing, like the, you know, the lessening of Earth as we move towards air? Is it sort of things starting to get lighter as we move out of this Earth cycle, or do you see
Well,
things?
don't forget that we're not in the, we got a mutation cycle, air to earth, excuse me, earth to air. That begins, but it doesn't begin until 2080.
Mm, yeah, I
So
thought.
we still got this is the thing you have to bear in mind and reflect on the last particularly the potency of the last 60 years. And interestingly, we just had, some 80-year markers with the end of World War II. And of course, that's when the U.S. established its primacy and its world reserve currency over all other nations. Now we're just now changing the tariff policies from tariff policies that were established in 45 and needed to be changed, and no one has had the courage to do it until Donald Trump. So that's I believe, auspicious that he's changing it when people like the status quo, they like the goodies that they get out of it, or the people who are getting impoverished by it. Well, let that be. That's the people who are doing well, which the U.S., the donor class, like to keep pushing for the status quo because they've done well by it. But in the process, what you've done is hollowed out the middle class, and you need a strong middle class in order to keep a strong, well, we're a democracy, but we're a constitutional republic. So we need to bring back that prosperity that goes across all the different levels of society, all the different levels of income, not just the very, very wealthy. And so I see a lot of signs that is shifting gears. It would not have shifted gears if Trump had not been elected.
Mm.
And so, because his policies are fomenting that, and if he succeeds, which he has every ability to do if he's not blocked by these forces that are trying to block him, are essentially whatever party they're in, because they can be what we call rhino Republicans. In other words, establishment Republicans. What it means is Republican in name only.
Mm.
They're just, they're the controlled opposition, as we call it.
Mm.
So if we get a stronger group of people supporting these policies across the world, but the U.S. is the leader. And if you didn't have a strong leader in this movement to oppose what globalism was doing, basically he did try to oppose it during COVID, and it was very tough. It was very tough. So you see, it's like, think of the tanker, takes miles and miles to get it to stop and turn around. This is a force that's been going for decades.
Mm.
And so I'm hopeful as I said, with the new Pope, that it's not absolutely clear what we're going to have, the new policies, but it's hopeful that he's got, his family is, well, he's closest to his two brothers. And we've been hearing them. They've been regularly being interviewed on television. Both of them are quite good on, being interviewed. I've heard more of Louis. They're both older brothers. They're within a couple of years of each other. This links the Pope to the U.S. And of course, that's why the U.S. has been the center of great entrepreneurial activities and inventions, and why China needs to copy ours, right? Because they're not taught to have their own minds and their own thoughts. So that's why we've had such enormous trillions of dollars in intellectual property rights schooling, right? So that's being turned around.
Mm.
And you could say, well, they have a right, Well, no, they don't actually. If you invent something and you take your business over to China, to now you're forced to turn over all your methods, all your secret technology to the Chinese.
Don't they get like sort of 51% controlling shares as well? The state has to be like 50%
yes.
shareholder, something like that. So yeah.
So Trump, a lot of certainly American, I'm sure other businessmen from other countries have made huge profits by this. The problem is in the end, is that it weakens most other nation states, including the United States, So it's really, and there's a wonderful quote. I don't have it right in front of me, but it's from Thomas Paine, and he basically says the cause. Thomas Paine was, of course, an amazing. He lived at the time of the Revolution. He was a British, colonial in the U.S. Well, the soon-to-be U.S., but an American colonialist, and he said that the cause of America was in many ways the cause of all mankind. And that's as true now as at the founding of our nation, that if we don't succeed in turning this around so that nation states are allowed to preserve their identities, they're allowed to have borders, they're allowed to have rules and laws. I mean, right now we have, as I just said, $31 billion spent in California, the state of California alone, I think in 1 year, on the illegal immigrants. I know that they're taking a huge amount of our health care. They're flooding our hospitals, our emergency services. And we look at, and then they get put in posh hotels, and they get credit cards, and they get told to vote Democrat, of course. So it's all very unfair to American tax-paying citizens. And I'm sure you could cite many things in the UK that are horror stories or unfair stories. I mean, it's been, I think, nothing short of catastrophic for much of Europe. And it's not to say, so this whole ideal of multicultural, so we have all these different cultures, but if you can't even speak the language and you can't even read the road signs, but this is where American citizens let the rest of us down. This is, again, Jupiter being weak with no ethics, saying, look, I'm going to hire this illegal immigrant because even though can't speak English and can't read the road signs and doesn't really know how to drive a truck, I'm going to hire him because I can get him for cheap. That's what's been happening in every area of life, including, it goes on, the H-1B1 visas, these tech workers, we've lost. I mean, American citizens, they get all these great educational degrees and then they can't get a job because foreigners are being hired, not because they're better. It's on a lottery system. They're getting hired because they're cheaper. So Trump is saying, no more of this. We're not allowing this anymore. It's still in the process. We have to turn it around because the latest statistic I saw was that I think 126,000 H-1B1 visas had been okayed for 2026. That's just not acceptable when you have hundreds of thousands of American tech workers out of work, right? So again, back to Jupiter-Saturn, you're favoring the almighty dollar over the rights of the citizen. Look, I pay my taxes. I got my education in this country. I worked hard. I made good grades. I deserve this salary with these healthcare benefits. And you don't want to pay me because you can get, let's face it, slave labor in another country or with so that's what this juncture point, that's what this is about. And so, the media is saying, oh, this is horrible that these people are being deported. Well, they were brought in illegally. And this is the shame, this is the crime of the Biden administration to tell the public night after night, as Mayorkas did, whatever his title was, that the United States border is absolutely secure when obviously it was not. And now people are wondering, well, why are we deporting all these people? Well, because they illegally brought them in and treated them better than many American citizens are treated. And that's wrong. But you see how that fits into the Jupiter-Saturn theme? What wins out? Saturn as the almighty dollar wins out. And that's not right.
I mean, I can see sort of like both sides of how this could go. I mean, looking at the natures of those two planets. So yes, you could get that kind of guru that's trying to act like a trader, like a merchant. So you kind of get that level of, you know, the highness of the Jupiter has been brought down by the Saturn. At the same time, you could get unconventional as well. And I think that's why you see the rise of the alternative media. I would see them as like unconventional. So they would never have been given an opportunity to get that kind of reach before. But because of the system getting kind of diversifying, people being forced out of things and forced to do something different, they're getting very entrepreneurial, aren't they? Look at, like you said, like people like Rogan, their reach is growing, whereas the sort of trust and faith in the system is deteriorating. They're becoming like the new voice. So I see this, I can see some benefits that could come out of that as well. It's not all bad. If you push in one direction, there has to be
Oh
some.
yeah, and that's part of the entrepreneurial um, beauty and gift of what the United States is about. You got somebody like Joe Rogan, who's essentially a mixed martial art person,
Hmm.
what was a comedian at one point, and then decides he doesn't. I don't know what the pivotal point was, but I think he decided he didn't like listening to any of the news because none of it fit his. None of it seemed like it was telling the truth, and the same thing happened with Tucker Carlson and many others. One point I meant to make, and we don't need to show the chart, but another important shift, and I do make this point as a Vedic astrologer, is that the 2020 conjunction was at 6 degrees
20.
and 20 minutes. So 6:20 Capricorn, which is the second Navamsha. Okay, second Navamsha of Capricorn, which is very important because remember how I've said that when the chart, like the 80, like for instance, if you have a very powerful standout conjunction, that has particularly the 61 because it's had influence for at least 60 years, right? And 80-81 had influence for the next 20 years for sure. Right now we're at this point, and I believe because it's in the second Navamsha, that makes it in Aquarius, because an Amsha runs for 3 degrees 20 minutes.
Hmm. Yeah.
And so somebody could say, if they're really wanting to debate me, they could say, well, that's not enough to change things. But then I'm watching events. And I say 2015 to 20. I'm just giving it an even 10 years surrounding 2020. But we notice even before 1921, you had major events in 1913
Hmm.
with the formation of the U.S. Federal Reserve Bank. So 8 years, that was 8 years. Now, in this case, the having it in Aquarius means Jupiter's no longer debilitated. Yes, it's still ruled by Saturn, but it's more, as we know, philosophically, Aquarius is more idealistic and more philosophical,
Hmm.
right? It's not so dollar oriented. So along comes Trump and says, this is not right that our middle class and our lower classes are totally hollowed out. That 1% of the population owns most everything.
Hmm.
And we've seen tremendous resistance, as we would expect. But I am very hopeful, particularly where we've had the shift in 2024. In my article called "The Long View of 2024," which I published in March of 24, 64 presidential national elections around the world, and plus you had a solar maximum.
Hmm.
So you had amazing things converging, which we're still feeling now.
Hmm.
And so I just feel that there are many reasons to be hopeful that there will be more return to the sacred and what we would consider the ethical, or we, from the point of a religious point of view. But the point is that the US, and not just because I happen to be American, but because our history indicates it, if we can pull, if we, as the anti-globalists, so not to be anti, but pro-nationalist, pro-sacred view of life, pro-individual rights, you see, they don't talk about this. If globalists do not, well, they do actually. Remember, there used to be that ad that said, "You'll own nothing and you'll be happy."
Mm.
Did you see that ad?
Yeah.
And and that's their idea. If you see that on Agenda 21, Agenda 2030, because if you eliminate personal rights, you also eliminate the right to own property.
Mm.
What do you own? You don't. You essentially, they want to control you, so you be in a building where they can monitor your every movement and surveil you and monitor your diet and your movements and your currency and how you use your money and so forth. So there's been an enormous impetus to do that. And I believe we're seeing the impetus to combat that. And it came all into a focus in 2020 with the COVID, where people were practically disappeared for countering the view of the, how shall I say, the official view. The official view that you had to have this vaccine or else, and you had to wear a mask or else, and you had to be 6 feet apart or else. And all of it turned out to be false, which many people knew at the time. But if you said so, you could get into trouble. So, see, given that was 5 years ago, I think you still see people wearing masks.
I still see people driving along in the car by themselves with a mask on sometimes, which
yes,
is funny.
Well, they've absorbed the propaganda, and I'm sorry for them. Propaganda is, as I said, in the U.S. chart, will be in the dasha of Rahu Mercury until March of 26. So hopefully, then you got Rahu Ketu, which is a continuation in a way for another year. But you could say, well, maybe that's going to be the end point and it's from September of 23, where that level of propaganda having that much control starts to, assuming that chart seems to have a lot of weight, seems to have a lot of accuracy. But moving away from that chart, just looking at these dates and these cycles, I think we're on a good path towards reform out of, we're not saying you shouldn't trade. There's dictionaries, I couldn't believe this, that say, I think the Oxford English Dictionary says it, basically defining globalism as international trade. Well, who would be against international trade? Of course. You trade with other countries.
Save the pandas. Who would want to save the pandas?
Yes, exactly. It's all in the language. Orwell had it right.
Well, let's. I think we're going to have to bring it to a close there. It's one of those topics where you could just indefinitely go on because
you could go on
because
I
you
do
can see connections, and the more this has been great to look at this as well, because kind of more I'm looking at it, the more I'm sort of thinking in terms of these nakshatras and the signs and the elements and the movement and the sort of planets that are concerned. But I think like we said right at the beginning, those two are particularly potent planets and slow moving, so their effect is really drawn out as they move through those signs and have a big effect on the whole chart. So it's a really interesting observation. I'm sure you've got lots more work to do and you'll be moving through this and finding more connections. So Just to summarize, probably we could just do this quickly, but if you want to follow your work at edithhathaway.com, you've got a regular newsletter that goes out. You can sign up for your newsletter. Your books are available on there. Obviously, like you said, there's the second, the installment of your book is coming out, and you'll cover this in more detail. Is there anything that you're doing or anything that's coming up where people can get a hold of you or watch what you're up to? Or I think the best thing is
Well, they
just
can, sure, that all those things that you said. And then my email is edith@edithhathaway.com. So if you have any thoughts or comments on any of this or insights,
I'm sure you'll get a few
um,
comments, don't worry. That's brilliant. Well, listen, thank you very much again for coming on. It's been really good. And yeah, look
thank
forward to
you.
talking to you again in the near future when you found more goodies. It'll be interesting to see what you come up with next. That's great. So thank you for
Okay.
coming, Edith. Appreciate it.
Thank you. Thank you, Andrew.